Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'm going to be sharing Bigfoot stories. Let's get into it. Story 1. We haven't paid much attention to the creatures. They aren't troublesome, scary, or mischievous like some report. Live and let live. This summer, my list of honeydew projects the wife gave me included building a small stepping bridge over the creek so we can get to the wild berry patch each spring without risking muddy shoes. We are too old to jump the creek anymore. I was hammering away, minding my own business, and comes lunchtime. The wife walks out the 60 yards to the creek, bringing lemonade and a sandwich. She says, "Watch your lunch." I was busy looking for where I put my leveler and paid little attention. I said thanks, and she went back to the house. I finished the lemonade and set the other half of ham sandwich down on a 1x4 and moved over on my hands and knees to saw off an overhang. Just as I'm about to get the saw, I hear loud breathing and think the wife is behind me. I glance around and look straight at two hairy legs, not more than 10 feet from two 25-pound sacks of quickset cement. It was our resident Bigfoot. He never came up this close before, and it startled me, to be truthful. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a warm and sunny Wednesday. The next few minutes were raw and intense, but I got a very good look at him. He's a big fellow, shiny gray bearded fellow. He commenced to squat down behind the wheelbarrow. He's too close, and I'm uncomfortable with him coming in that close. In front of this big fellow is a wheelbarrow, and beyond that a 50-60 yard clearing to the back porch. I tried to shoo him away by shouting, "Go home." Probably a dumbass thing to say, but he wasn't responding. It's a he. His knees were spread open in my direction in a squat position, so now I stand up and motion, pointing to the area where he usually stares at from, and wave and shout, "Go home." He watched me intently and fingered the box of nails set out on the ground. The thing I never noticed before at a distance was hearing him breathe. It's very loud and rhythmic, hollow sounding, like breathing in a metal tube. Have you heard this? After that, we stared at each other. It seemed like a long time, but probably wasn't. I remembered his eyes nervously twitched between me, the trees, and what was left of my sandwich. I felt there was another one in the trees somewhere, but I never saw it. I stood over him during the stare time, and then he finally stood to his feet and backed away, never taking his eyes off me. Afraid of him at that point, I quickly sat down cross-legged and watched his every move. My head was pounding. Then here is what I wanted you to know about. It was this part. After he stood up, he backed up to the other side of the wheelbarrow and stopped, stared, and then he reached down, grabbed a fistful of dirt and leaves and threw it at me. Have you ever heard of this happening before? Then he takes a few more steps backward and does it again. I don't know what that was supposed to mean, but at that point he turned and walked away at a pretty good clip, looking back at me twice. He went off to the area where we usually see him watching, and was lost in the dense foliage and trees that surrounded the property. I am 68 years old, and it still frazzles me. I told my wife about it, and she said she saw the last part of it, the dirt throwing. I've read about rocks being thrown, but not this. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. This is a second-hand account that took place near Indianapolis, Indiana. The witness had just gotten off work early and was traveling down 200 North. One of his co-workers was traveling in front of him, a good 300 feet or so, when he noticed that he had swerved rather fast, so the witness expected a deer to come running out, but that was not the case. What he saw was a black-furred animal on two legs, walking all hunched over. He quickly tried avoiding it, but he believes he clipped it with his back end. He stopped, not sure what had just happened, and started looking in the driver's side mirror. He didn't see anything for a few seconds, but then something stood up right behind his Explorer. Terrified, the witness rolled down his window and could see the fear on his friend's eyes, who confirmed that he had seen the same creature. His friend started back to see it and heard it howling. The witness looked through the windshield and saw the creature trying to stand up on two legs again, but kept falling over. It eventually got on all fours and ran off into the woods. The two men then got out of their vehicles to look around, but did not see anything again. However, they noticed a large mouse-looking rodent on the side of the road, which was not afraid of them at all. They even picked it up and put it off in the grass. Story 3. A couple were mushroom hunting along Big Walnut Creek in western Indiana. The two had separated to cover a bigger area in the forest, looking for morel mushrooms. In Indiana, these are a gourmet delicacy and are sold for $20 to $30 per pound. The man was finding several remains of mushrooms that had already been picked, and he had decided that other mushroom hunters had already picked the area. His wife was finding the same thing, and she was losing interest in finding any mushrooms. She had decided that the mushrooms that had been already picked had been done so very recently. Then she spotted a very small one that had apparently been missed by the earlier hunters. When she bent over to pick it, she could hear a breathing sound. When she looked up, she could see a man. He was about 50 feet away and was staring at her. As she looked closer, she could see it was not a man, but as she described it, as a man/ape, covered in blackish brown hair, about 7 feet tall, standing next to a tree, and it was motionless. The more she looked, it became like a statue, completely motionless. She looked in the direction of where she thought her husband was, and when she looked back where this creature was standing, it was still there, except now it was completely behind the tree. All she could see was its shoulder. It was being very still. She yelled and started running through the forest in the direction of where they had parked their truck. Her husband hollered back, and he set out to find out what was wrong. When he found her, she was back at the truck, shaking uncontrollably. She told him what she saw, and he remarked that he kept hearing something following him, and he thought that it was his wife, and now he realized she had been looking for mushrooms in the opposite direction to where he was hearing footsteps and low vocal-like chatter. Story 4. Upon returning home from getting my husband some cigarettes in Cloverdale, Indiana, at the SR 243 exit off I-70, I traveled my usual path down a road called Jackie Dunn Hill Road. I had traveled down the road a short distance of maybe just over the third of the small hill and saw something on the left side of the road. At first it appeared to be a black tree, but at the very edge of the road. I knew it was not a tree when it moved. Turning to face my headlights path, I could see a huge man-like thing, covered in black hair. Its face was very dark black, and I could not see much detail, but I could see it was man-like. Then it turned back towards the woods it was coming out of, and it took 2 very large gated steps and was out of my sight. It sent chills down my spine seeing it, and I could not go down that road without sense of fear. I used to hunt for mushrooms in the woods on the other side of the road, the way it was headed, but I will never go in there again. In fact, I will never go into the woods by myself again. I used to hunt mushrooms and squirrel, and I usually always went by myself, but not after seeing that. I have never been a non-believer in Bigfoot, but unless you have actually seen one, you are naturally going to have your doubts, just as I did. I can now honestly say that I have absolutely no doubts whatsoever that Bigfoots really do exist. Story 5. This story takes place in Morgan County, Indiana in 1983. A college student was attending Indiana University moved into an A-frame house in the fall of 1983 that was located on Low Gap Road, which bordered Morgan-Monroe State Forest. The home sat off the road far enough you could easily drive right by it. One evening, he was visited by a couple of students that had stopped by to celebrate the start of the school year and whatever else occasion that would give him the excuse to drink a lot of alcohol. About 1:30 a.m., the young man that lived in the house decided to walk out on his deck to take a look at the full moon that was lighting up the forest. The moon was so bright it seemed like you could see every rock, tree, and blade of grass that made up the forest floor. He saw a possum that was waddling through the underbrush heading towards his trash can. As he looked down the trail that ran down the back of his house, He thought he could see someone walking on the trail, and they seemed to be heading towards his home. He squatted down and watched to see if he could make out who it might be. As the figure came closer, he noted this person was huge, and it looked like a football player wearing a fur coat. Then he thought, it's too warm to be wearing a fur coat. As the student watched this figure, he recognized this is not a person, because it is too big, it had no neck, and the walk was very unusual. The figure did not really swing its arms a great deal, and the arms were very long, and the stride was not human-like at all. Panicked, he ran into the house and told his guests to lock themselves in the back bedroom because they were about to be visited by something, and he did not know what it was. The student went to his gun cabinet and pulled out a machine gun that was part of his collection. He loaded the gun and walked out his back door. At first he did not see anything in the darkness, then he looked to his side and he could see a huge black shape standing at the edge of the forest. He was about 30 feet away. Without any hesitation, he started shooting and sprayed the shape with several bullets from the gun. It seemed to slip into the woods, and he could hear it crashing through the heavy undergrowth. He ran back into the house and announced to his guests that he had shot someone or something and to stay in the bedroom. The two guests said that when they heard the gunshots, something ran by their window, which was located on the other side of the house. The man told his guests that they would wait for daylight, then they would look for the body. They told him that they were not going to look for anything, and they were leaving. He thought that if he had shot and killed a human, that he was going to bury it in the forest and not tell anyone. At daylight, he walked out of the house and he started looking for the spot where the shape was standing. He saw several shell casings lying on the ground, and he could see where the grass was mashed down from something very big standing on it. He also saw where it ran through the underbrush, and the trail was very easy to follow. The trail headed down a ravine, and all of a sudden it joined a very well-established trail that followed the ridge behind his home. The trail would go straight, and all of a sudden it would make a really weird jolt. This occurred several times, and when he got to looking, and he realized that every time it did, there were really low-hanging limbs. His conclusion that whatever was using this trail was so tall that instead of ducking underneath the limb, it was simply walking over it. The trail stopped at the top of the ridge behind his home, and at the end of the trail there was a bare spot on the ground about 20 feet in diameter. In the dust and mud there were several human-like footprints, different sizes. One print was easily over 20 inches long. Looking around, he figured that whoever was standing on this bare spot had a perfect view of his home, and whoever stood in this spot could also see everything coming and going from his home. He never found a body. Story 6. I've been a skeptic most of my life, but I know what I experienced back in 1995. The encounter of what I believe may have been a Sasquatch occurred at a small tributary pond next to Moosehead Lake called Prong Pond. My father and I, along with a close friend, decided to give the small pond a shot at fishing since the smallmouth bass population was doing well. There was only one road into the pond, which ended at the only boat launch. The shoreline of the lake was underdeveloped and very heavy wooded, giving the pond a very secretive and eerie appearance. Once we set up camp at the boat launch, we got underway paddling to the other side of the pond to do some fishing. We were fishing for maybe a half hour when we all experienced a cry coming from the shoreline, which appeared fairly close, but could not pinpoint an exact location because of heavy fir boughs. At first, I had thought it was a bird of prey of some sort, then the screams took on a more human form, sounding like a laughing hyena, and they were very powerful. We continued to fish, but wondering what the hell was the crying like. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we set back to camp, had dinner, and talked for a bit around a campfire. My dad had mentioned that a good fishing guide friend some years back had told him that he was fishing the same pond and was close to the location where we had been that day, and saw a huge hairy creature stooping on the shoreline, watching him inquisitively. Then the creature knew that he had noticed it, and stood up and turned to exit in the firs behind him, banging its head on a limb. My dad's friend, being startled and kind of creeped out, waited for a bit before pulling the canoe onto the shore. He measured the height of the branch that the creature had banged its head on, and it measured around 8 feet tall. He was pretty daring, because you could have never have gotten me to ever pull my canoe up on the shore anywhere near that thing. Having heard my father's story raised the hairs on my arms. We eventually turned in, and though I was a little nervous, I dozed off fairly quickly. Around what I supposed to be 2 in the morning, I was jolted out of my sleep by a horrendous scream out in the woods to the left of the tent. The scream was similar to the screams we had heard earlier. I asked my dad and friend if they had heard it. They said they had been up for a bit listening to it. The screams went on for a while, then stopped, started again, sounding farther away. This went on for most of the night till morning came, and we decided to pack up and leave, which I believe was a wise choice. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.